Oh boy, we are jumping into a spicy hot topic today because I am going to chime in on a very heated debate and conversation happening online right now, and it has to do with more quotes from Eiji Aonuma in an interview he gave to IGN, where he's discussing fans' desire, or I should say he's discussing some fans' desire, for a return to some of the more classic 3D Zelda styles as opposed to the more open world Breath of the Wild style, and he classifies those older games as restricted, and he classifies some gamers' opinions as more nostalgia based than anything else. It has a lot of people heated and talking, and I have my own pretty strong opinions on this whole thing, and so I want to talk about it. Of course, really quickly, I do want to let you guys know that I am trying to cross 25,000 subscribers and hoping to do that sometime in the next few months. So if this is your first video on the channel, or if you've been watching for a while and have not been subscribed, then I hope you consider subscribing after watching this video to help me cross that milestone sooner than later. But with that aside, let's jump into this crazy situation around Aonuma's quotes. I'm going to read his response to a question about this topic and fans' desire for the more classic Zelda game, again, that he was giving with IGN, and then give you my thoughts on what he said. So, here is his response to IGN's question. Well, I do think as people, we have a tendency to want the thing that we don't currently have, and there's a bit of a grass is greener mentality. But I also think that with the freedom players have in the more recent games in this series, there still is a set path. It just happens to be the path that they choose. So I think that that is one thing I kind of like to remind myself about the current games that we're making. But also, it's interesting when I hear people say those things because I am wondering, why do you want to go back to a type of game where you're more limited or more restricted in the type of things or ways that you can play? But I do understand that desire that we have for nostalgia, and so I can also understand it from that aspect. So again, that's essentially his response to the question about how some people want the older style of Zelda games as opposed to the more open world style that we've seen in the last two games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Now, as I said at the beginning, I do have my own pretty strong opinions about this, but I also can understand both perspectives as well. So to share my general thoughts before we start to dissect it and get into the nitty-gritty, let me just tell you surface level my actual thoughts. First and foremost, as I've said numerous times over the years on this channel, I love Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think they are both fantastic games. They are both close to 10 out of 10 for me, separate from comparing them to prior Zelda games or different styles of Zelda games or whatever. I absolutely love both games, and I think that the way Breath of the Wild introduced a new take on an insanely awesome open world was amazing. I like the story, I like the gameplay, I like the change to the Zelda formula, and of course I've been a fan of Zelda since the first game on the NES. I've loved all eras and all iterations of the Zelda franchise. I've pretty much never been let down. I mentioned that in my last video, actually. And so, even with the change to the open world style and the amazing things they achieved with the two current games, I love those games. But whether it's nostalgia or whether it's just personal taste, there is a huge part of me that does enjoy and miss the older style of the 3D games. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, Wind Waker, my favorite Zelda game of all time, by the way. And Twilight Princess. Did I say that game? I don't even remember if I said that. You know, all of the older games, from the Ocarina of Time all the way up to Skyward Sword before we got that shift with Breath of the Wild, I love those games. I miss some of the linear aspects of the games while still having huge areas to explore. I miss having traditional dungeons. I miss having a companion. And one of the elements that not a lot of people talk about, although a good friend of mine, Miza on his channel actually has talked about this recently, and I appreciate him bringing this up because I agree with this. Another thing those games did is they give you very specific items that have special aspects and qualities to them, and they do special things that once you acquire those items, typically found in the traditional dungeons, it changes the way you experience the rest of the game and interact with the world after you achieve that item. That's something that the two newer games on the Switch, as amazing as they are, don't really do in the same way. And so again, just speaking for myself, I find myself being a fan of all things Zelda. I love and miss and appreciate and in some ways prefer the classic 3D Zelda games and styles, but I also am just completely infatuated with the two Switch open world games as well. There's no right or wrong answer. I may have some preferences here and there, but in general, they're all good to me. Now, one disclaimer I want to say before I jump into actually dissecting his specific quotes and opinions and thoughts here is that I'm not trying to say, as just a random guy who happens to be a big fan of The Legend of Zelda, I'm not trying to say that I'm the authority here. I'm not trying to say that I know better than Eiji Aonuma, somebody who's been working on the franchise and in the industry for decades. I'm just sharing my opinion as a fan and somebody who's a lifelong gamer of over 40 years, who at the very least has that life experience playing video games, understanding the end result, and playing every Zelda game ever, and also understanding what makes certain aspects of the games good or not good. And so that's all I'm saying. I'm not telling you to agree with my opinion either. This is something I bring up in a lot of my videos. I'm just sharing my opinion. I'm not telling you to feel the exact same way. And so, with that disclaimer out of the way, to talk about what he said, I'm going to jump into the hardest parts of this conversation first, okay? And basically discuss the elements that I very much disagree with when it comes to his statements. The main thing I think I want to point out is I don't really like or agree with his classification of the older games as limiting or restricting. I think that's a reductive viewpoint, and I don't think, and again, I know he's the authority, he's the game developer, and I am not, so again, I'm not oblivious to this, but I don't think he's really being accurate or fair to those games when he calls them restricted. Now, if somebody wants to be super reductive and super surface level and just compare a game like Skyward Sword or Ocarina of Time directly to Breath of the Wild, you could say, yeah, you can do a lot more things in Breath of the Wild than you can in the other games, and so the other games are quote-unquote restricted. That's definitely a way you can look at it, and obviously, in a sense, that does make sense to me, but I actually think that that's not really, again, fair to these older games. What Aonuma is calling restricted is something that I see as purposeful game design. It's just a purposeful choice to say, this is the game we're telling, this is the path we're designing from beginning to end through the game, and there are certain beats and plot points and weapon upgrades and items that you get in a fairly linear order, with a story that plays out in a linear order, and general areas that you go through in a set path, and that's it. That's just the game. And so he might be talking about it and using the word restricted simply because he's been the one making the games and working with the different, levels of hardware he's been working with over the decades, and Breath of the Wild is a game that became available to him with better hardware. So maybe from a game developer standpoint, you compare Breath of the Wild to older games and you see them as restricted. But I actually, again, don't see it that way. I see it simply as purposeful game design. We are deciding to tell our story in this way and make our game and your journey through it in a specific way. And that's all it is. And if you think about it, most games are not open world games. In the history of all video games ever created, including today, most games are not open world, and therefore most games have some sort of purposeful linear path through them. Even if you can pick and choose and do some things in certain orders throughout the experience, you're playing the game from A to B to C in some fashion, the single player games I should say. And I think that they're all good for those ways, and I think that the Zelda games, the classic ones, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, take your pick, they're the same way. They're not restricted. They are designed to be the way that they are. I think a great comparison I could make could be to take something that isn't a Legend of Zelda game and make this same kind of comparison, right? So let's take something like a Resident Evil game. In a Resident Evil game, you play from A to B to C, and you go through the cities, and you go through the towns, and you go through the sewers, and you go through the Umbrella lab stations, and whatever you're doing in any one of the Resident Evil games you want to choose. And you play from that game from the beginning to the end, and that's the experience. And you get the story and certain upgrades and items and meet certain characters in a certain order, and that's what you do. And those games are famous games. It's a famous franchise, and most games are considered to be classics and incredible, even the more modern ones that are very much the same kind of idea. Maybe they afford you a little bit more freedom, but the general path from beginning to end is somewhat linear. And I think it would be unfair to say, when you play Resident Evil 7 or Resident Evil 4 Remake or whatever, why can't you just go to any building and any door in any city in the entire country at any time and just experience the story and meet characters and fight enemies in whatever order? Why are they, quote unquote, restricting you to starting in this place and ending in this place? It's restrictive that you can't play Resident Evil 4 and explore any country and any city at any time. Obviously, that's an insane, crazy take. Those games are considered extremely high quality. They're not considered restrictive, but they play out in a linear fashion from A to B to C. That's a normal single-player game. And I think you could take a game like that, Resident Evil, you could take a game like, I don't know, The Last of Us or Uncharted, Naughty Dog's kinds of games, whatever the case may be, even like a Halo game with the exception of Infinite, because that's got an open world feel to it. You play these games from beginning to end, and no one thinks of them as restricted because you can't do everything you want at any time. They are literally designed to be played in that linear fashion, but no one is holding it against them that they're linear. So why are we now retroactively suddenly applying this restricted and limited moniker and labeling to these older games that were just simply designed to be played from beginning to end in somewhat of a straight line? Lest we also forget that those games also still, and I'm talking about the Zelda games now, they still offered a level of freedom. You could go to different towns and different locations and find plenty of things and side quests and NPCs or whatever in different orders, and that includes the first 3D Zelda game, which is the Ocarina of Time. I mean, heck, that game allowed you to literally jump back and forth between time whenever you wanted once you unlocked that ability. And so I just find it to be a strange way to classify those old games as restricted. Another heated point when it comes to some of what he said is the idea of classifying people's desire for the old games as nostalgia. And, you know, I'm 50-50 on this because part of me does understand what he's saying, and he's not wrong. I mean, I've always been very openly a nostalgia bias kind of guy, you know? I think that some people can have recency bias, some people can have nostalgia bias. I'm a nostalgia bias guy, and I know that. A lot of times, some of my favorite games or experiences or movies or video game consoles, they might not hold up the best today through a 2023 lens, but as somebody who experienced them in their times and can compare them to what they were like when they were new, that's a lot of why I like them. Like, I think Mario 64 is a better game, or I should say it's a game I like more than Mario Odyssey, even though Mario Odyssey looks and plays way more modern by comparison. But my nostalgia bias means, yeah, I love Mario 64 and I appreciate it for what it is more than I do Mario Odyssey, you know? And so I can say, when I think about the classic Zelda games, the reason I miss dungeons and NPCs and even a little bit of a linear format is because, yeah, I experienced those games and I do certainly miss them. But to go back to my previous point about purposeful game design, I also think when he talks about nostalgia, that's also a little bit misguided because that's also discounting the fact that those games are also still really excellent. Wind Waker is my favorite game, not just because of nostalgia, but because it's literally excellent even today. Just like Ocarina of Time, just like Twilight Princess, those games are actually good. It's not nostalgia completely coloring our opinions of them. They're actually good games for what they are, and I don't think it's fair to just say people like them only because of nostalgia either. Now, when I consider the other side of this conversation and the other perspective of his quotes and what I think he's trying to get at, I also understand that. Again, I'm a fan of the two Switch games and the open world games. I think they're fantastic. And I'm excited to see where Nintendo and Aonuma might take future Zelda games that are not one of these two games, but maybe kind of exploring and evolving the open world style. So, to go back to one of the earlier points I made, if you were to compare the classic games to the two Switch games, yes, you can do more things in Breath of the Wild and in Tears of the Kingdom. And you have a lot more freedom, admittedly, which again is the opposite of restricted. So I know that that's kind of the nuance of talking about this conversation, right? There is a lot more freedom to those newer games and the open world games. And as I said, I love that. I think it was a great welcome change to the franchise, and I'm not even necessarily asking for that to go away. It's also worth considering that those two games released over the course of the past 6 years are releasing in an era where open world game design is like at an all-time high, and it's like, it's the bee's knees, man. Every game and every franchise and new IPs and everyone is doing open worlds, and it's great. I like open world design games just as much as I like linear games. Like, again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but I truly find value in both. And so I think that's part of why, by the time they had an opportunity to make an open world game with Breath of the Wild, because the Switch hardware allowed for it, and the Wii U hardware, I should say, that it was designed for, I can see why they eventually went there, and I think that that was a great choice. And the climate of video games right now is, it's like online battle royale nonsense that I have no interest in, and it's also open worlds for single player. Those are like the big kind of genres and like what the gaming culture is and landscape is right now. So those games made sense to release the way they are in this time. And clearly Aonuma is also hinting at the future when he talks about comparing the old restricted styles to the new open world styles. And it's worth noting, I mean, here's the thing. From a business perspective, we can't ignore the truth in sales. The Switch is so insanely popular that that's obviously helping inflate the sales numbers for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But outside of that, because the games are also both so fantastic and incredible, that's part of why they've sold as well as they've sold. I mean, between the two of them, I think they've sold like over 50 million copies combined, and that'll probably hit 60 million by the time Tears of the Kingdom eventually hits the end of its sales burst. So the popularity and the business and the dollars and cents of the franchise definitely says the gamers currently like the open world design, so keep doing that and maybe don't pay attention to the old style. So I get what he's saying. He's not entirely wrong. I don't personally want my favorite gaming franchises totally dictated by sales if I feel differently. But at the same time, I understand, and I'm not going to be sad if they follow the dollars and cents and make more games that are more like the two newer games than they are the classic games. But I think a missing component to this larger conversation, and I don't really think I've seen enough people really drive this home. Maybe somebody has and I haven't heard their opinion, but I'm going to share my own perspective on it here, and I've even touched on this in videos in the past as well. The missing component here is so blatantly obvious to the point that it almost makes this entire online debate a moot point, which in a way kind of makes this entire like 20-minute video conversation I'm having a moot point, but this is where we are. The solution to all of this, you guys, it's so simple. You can do both Nintendo and Aonuma. You can literally have a huge open world game that provides the player an overwhelming sense of freedom, but you can also have a fairly linear approach to the game design, to the dungeon and the temple design, to the order in which certain items might be achieved, and to the order that the story and the cutscenes are delivered to you. I talked about this on a podcast with my friend Andre's Restart a couple of months ago about Tears of the Kingdom. It could be possible to, if we look at Tears of the Kingdom as a template, where you find the dragon's tears in random orders, whatever order you happen to stumble across them as you're exploring Hyrule, and each dragon's tear is a specific cutscene, so you can find those cutscenes in different orders based on when and where you find the dragon's tears. Well, there's another way that you could deliver a story in Tears of the Kingdom, and it's that the Dragon Tears locations are in the exact same place they are now, and you can find them in any order. However, the cutscenes are still delivered to you in a specifically designed order. So it doesn't matter what order you find the locations, the cutscenes are given to the player in a predetermined order, and they're not unique to the location that you find the dragon's tears. That kind of design can be applied to future games so that the story and the items and the dungeons all happen in a specific order, but you have an entire huge open world to explore and find things in different ways and in different orders and get your side quests and do that whole thing. And you literally can create the perfect combination between old and new. And so in my opinion, you throw in a brand new companion character, you throw in some kind of new musical instrument item that's kind of the crux of the story and the adventure, and you've literally created the perfect hybrid Zelda game that I think will make most players extremely happy. You have the open world freedom of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which is hopefully going to aid in the massive sales success those games have seen, create a whole new world of Hyrule that's open world, and you get the classic Zelda formula in a way. In a sense, you get the skeleton of that by having dungeons that are a little bit more like the older style, and you play through them in a specific order, and the story and the cutscenes are given to you in a predetermined order so that the story plays out organically. You can literally do all of the above in one game. And so, to wrap this up, I like to think that Aonuma and Nintendo knows that there is a better balance that can be struck. And clearly, they're hearing and understanding the fact that there are fans out there who do miss the older style of Zelda game. Even if they do or don't like the newer ones, they miss that stuff, so they're not oblivious to it. So They're smart people. They're a smart company. Aonuma is an incredibly talented, smart developer. He's one of my favorite people in the games industry because he makes Zelda games, my second favorite franchise, and every one he's ever been involved in, to me, is a masterpiece. And so because they're smart people and a smart company, I want to think that they know they can do just what I said. Make a future Zelda game that is the best of both worlds. It is very achievable. You just got to make that your choice when you sit down to start making that game. So hopefully that's what they do. These are my very long thoughts, again, on a very spicy topic. I have no idea what the reception to this conversation will be because people are so passionate on one side or the other. But, you know, I'm going to open the floodgates, man. I want to hear what you guys think. You know, do you agree with my general takeaways? Do you find it to be different? What do you think about Aonuma's quotes? What do you want from Zelda going forward? Talk about it below. Again, please consider subscribing to the channel if this is your first time here. Help me cross that milestone, and I'll catch you guys next time on another video.